35. Wick watched in horror as the buzzing stream of black fog erupted from his friend's nose and mouth, leaving him in some kind of zombie state. The snake-like cloud of fog soared upwards, spun, and then dove into an odd metal box. "Gryph?" The buzzing grew louder and more intense, and the black fog surged from the metallic box and flew towards them. On instinct, he sent a thonic bolt screaming towards this strange enemy, but the twining tendrils parted and the bolt of crimson energy flew harmlessly past. It increased speed and dove at them. The fog reached Ovidum first, circling his head like a swarm of angry bees before plunging down and into his mouth and nostrils. The Zidai's horrid scream lasted long, agonizing seconds before he went silent. The fog erupted from his mouth, now thinner and less dense. It twined up and into the air and plunged back into the adamantine cube. "What the hell?" Wick yelled. Without taking his eyes off of Ovidum, Wick bellowed, "Avernarius, kill Mirthandir!" The abyssal terror activated his sword of magma and ran towards the Prince Regent. He was barely halfway to the control panel when several dozen arachnids fired webbing at the monstrous chthonic demon. The first several strands didn't even slow the beast down, but then 10, 20, 100 of the sticky ropes took hold and the demon slowed to a crawl. The fiery beast swung its claymore, and several dozen of the automatons melted and exploded. Then 100 more strands wrapped up Avernarius's sword arm and held it fast. The demon tried to pull away the sticky substance with its free hand, but only trapped that hand as well. The arachnids cocooned the demon and pulled it from its feet. Had Wick been a man of earth instead of a gnome of the realms, a vision of Gulliver versus the Lilliputians would have filled his mind. The demon hit the ground with a boom, and his magma sword extinguished as it fell from his grasp. Several hundred more jets of webbing secured the demon to the ground, where it roared in fury before more webbing covered its mouth, gagging it. "Well, shite!" Wick grunted, pushing Tifila back. Ovidum stood rigid as a statue, and then his yellow eyes opened, the whites now swimming with hundreds of tiny black dots. He turned and swung his saber at Eret, who barely blocked the adjudicator's surprise blow with his axe. Eret stumbled backwards as another stream of the microscopic mites forced themselves into his mouth and nose. The warborn hacked and coughed, and Ovidum turned from him and launched himself at Wick. The Zidai stabbed down at the gnome with a machine-like precision, and Wick ducked, barely avoiding a decapitating blow. "What the hell are you doing?" Behind Ovidum, Eret was on his knees, hacking and coughing. He opened his mouth and vomited up the stream of black. It pulsed from him and spun into the air, where it slowed, turned into white ash, and faded in the wind. Eret stood, his expression one of furious anger, as he grabbed Ovidum by the wrist, arresting another blow that would have taken Wick's arm. The Zidai turned in surprised rage, but before he could react, the massive warborn tossed him back over his head with all the effort of a litterer tossing an empty beer can from a car window. Ovidum smashed against the far wall and fell in a heap, unconscious. "You're immune?" Wick asked in awe. "I am Eret. I am wrong," the warborn said, as if that simple explanation explained anything at all. "Not sure that's an answer," Wick said, but his eyes went wide as another streamer of black spun up and behind the warborn. It changed direction and tore down, splitting into two streams as it moved around a clumsy swing of Edith's axe and soared into Wick, scouring his throat and nostrils. From the depths inside his mind prison, Gryph screamed as the mites bore into Wick. His body stood rigid, his blank face revealing none of the turmoil that boiled inside him. Then, a pulse of warmth spread like a vortex of well-being from the center of his forehead, and pinpricks of light exploded against his eyelids. Millions of the tiny magical machines infesting Gryph's brain turned to points of light as the healing warmth extinguished them. His eyes snapped open, and he knew that the Godhead had cleansed him of the infection. How? Gryph looked around to see Wick shaking as the infectious mites took control of him. For the briefest of moments, he wondered why his friend's skin was now a deep purple, but he had no time to dwell on it. Tifila rushed to Wick's side and took his head gently in both hands, trying to ease his seizure. Green light flowed from her hands into his head, and he calmed. Another stream came at her from behind. Gryph tried to yell a warning, but his throat was so scoured by the mites that his voice came out as a bare croak. Gryph watched helpless as the mites took control of Tifila just as her spell freed Wick. The gnome looked at her with total understanding as the woman he loved, the woman that had cured him instead of saving herself, was taken by the mind-robbing power of the black fog. I cannot let this weapon escape the city, Gryph realized, even if it means we don't either. Wick, frozen by fear, watched Tifila's face turn towards him with emotionless purpose. Wick, move! Gryph yelled, but the gnome stared, as if paralysis had taken him. Gryph tossed his rope as Tifila drew one of her life-enhanced blades, a short curved sword of pulsing green light. The arcane light of animate rope flared around his hand again. The rope whip-snapped as if alive and wrapped itself around Tifila's arm as her sword thrust down. Her blank expression did not change as the rope stopped her from landing a killing blow. Wick's shoulders slumped as the truth that his love had nearly murdered him filled his mind. Wick, get your tiny ass up and move! Gryph yelled, but the warlock could not take his eyes off the impassive murder machine with the face of his love. Gryph ran towards them as Tifila strained against the rope. Gryph used compel, but felt no conscious mind push back through the link, just cold purpose. Tifila's other hand drew her second blade from her waist, and she stabbed downwards. Wick moved at the last second, preventing the blade from piercing his heart, but it bit down into his shoulder. He screamed, and Gryph knew it was only partially from the physical pain. Tifila yanked the dagger free and brought it high. Tiff, please, no! Wick begged, but the one-time gentle gnome life-master didn't even acknowledge his despair. She thrust down again, but this time it clanged against the metal of Gryph's spear. Tifila's head snapped towards Gryph as she flailed at him. He dropped his spear and caught her wrist and cast Water Blast with his free hand. Water pummeled into her, and she spun back like a boat in a tsunami to smash against the front of the control table. Something crunched in her as she hit the hard stone of the table, and Wick whimpered. A pang of guilt shot through Gryph, but he retrieved his spear and dragged the gnome to his feet. We must fight! I will not hurt her, Wick said with desperate conviction. Nor will I if I can help it, but we cannot allow her or Ovrim to hurt us either. Zeg ported next to Tifila, and then squealed and ported again as she swung her life blade at him in a wide, clumsy arc. The blow to her head slowed her, but had not knocked any awareness into her. The imp ported onto Wick's shoulder and smacked him upside the head.
"What you do, pretty lady?"
Wick didn't move, didn't even complain at the imp's mistreatment. He could not take his eyes off Tifila. Gryph pulled both gnome and imp to their feet. Wick stole a glance at Gryph, one full of desperation and pleading, one that begged Gryph to tell him what to do.
"We have another problem,"
Eret said, and backed his way to them, shielding them from the encroaching swarm of arachnids. Each swipe of his massive axe shredded and crushed several automatons, but more kept coming. Gryph made a quick assessment of the situation. Both Overem and Tifila were getting to their feet, shaking off the effects of their wounds. I need to take them out of the equation. His eyes snapped to a length of chain hanging from the ceiling, the links twisted with the remnants of ancient fibers. Gryph guessed it had once held some kind of tapestry that had fallen to the ravages of the passing millennia. He cast animate rope again, and the chain twined both Tifila and Overem, dragging them to the safety of an alcove in the wall. They struggled and pulled at their bonds with no hint of emotion. Gryph feared they would damage themselves, but he could not spend any mental effort on the worry and forced his mind back to the battle. While he'd been distracted, Mirthandir had ordered the black fog into the cavernous chamber where the warborn slumbered. Gryph watched as the might swirled down and into several of the massive warriors. Bodies convulsed and then eyes snapped open, swimming with black.
"We need to get to Mirthandir,"
Gryph said.
"He is somehow controlling the weapon."
"Yes, the Iron Crown controls the black fog," Eret said.
"We need Avernarius,"
Wick said. All eyes turned to the prone demon, struggling against the sticky webbing that bound it. Gryph knew the strength of those strands and doubted even the mighty abyssal terror could tear himself free. A childhood memory popped into Gryph's mind, one that involved an old barn, dozens of spiderwebs, a cigarette lighter, and a beating from his father after he'd almost burned the whole barn to ash. He looked down at the imp, and a plan formed in his mind.
"Zeg,"
Gryph said, and the imp's eyes turned to him. "Burn." The imp grinned and ported from Wick's shoulder to the struggling mound of sticky fibers that was the abyssal terror. Twin jets of flame flared from the imp's outstretched hands, and the webbing charred and parted. Avernarius roared, not in pain, but in delight, and soon the lumbering hellbeast was free. It looked down at Zeg, a wicked grin of dagger-length teeth splitting its face, and Zeg pointed at Mirthandir.
"Kill!"
Avernarius's monstrous sword reformed from nothing, a molten totem of magma and flame. He roared and rushed at the elf lord.
"Did it just take orders from Zeg?"
Wick asked, bewildered. The question hung unanswered as the arachnids breached Eret's defenses, drawing all their attention. Wick drew energy to the end of his staff and spun, smashing his way through the machines. Eret and Gryph both became swirling scythes of destruction, and soon the detachment of arachnids sent at them lay shattered at their feet. A clang like a massive bell being rung rushed over them as Avernarius brought his weapon down upon Mirthandir. The sword bounced off an invisible field of energy that shimmered a dull gray under the corona of flames surging off of the demon's blade. Avernarius, it seemed, had taken none too kindly to being bound. It attacked again, doubling down on both speed and intensity. Mirthandir fell to his knees, his staff skittering away under the blows. The elf lord pumped mana into his shield, and Gryph hoped Avernarius could smash his way through. Then a torrent of the black fog swirled up and behind the massive demon and flew into his roaring mouth. Avernerius collapsed, the noise of his hacking cough sounding like an earthquake. The demon quivered, and its muscles flexed as it tried to fight off the infection. Then it fell forward and collapsed. For a moment, everyone in the room just stared at the prone demon, waiting to see what would happen. Gryph locked eyes with Mirthandir, whose lips curled into a wicked grin as the demon stumbled to its feet. It swayed for a moment before finally turning to look at Gryph, Wick, and Eret. The demon's eyes swam with black mites. "Shite!" Wick howled as the demon sprinted towards them. "You make mad!" Zeg said. Eret leapt forward and swung his axe at the demon, but Avernerius blocked the blow with a casual backswing. Eret spun away from the contact and sunk his axe into the demon's side. It grunted in pain and gave the Warborn a look that may have been grudging respect before punching him in the face with his free hand. Eret flew back, his axe clattering from his hand. Gryph sent a flying stalactite at the demon before he could get his guard up. The stone spear bit into its shoulder between two of the magma plates, slowing it. Wick raised his hands high in a casting gesture that Gryph had never seen, and then thrust down towards the floor. A rift to the chthonic realm opened, and a swirling vortex of blood-red smoke and jagged spears of putrescent yellow lightning exploded into the room and spun towards the demon. As it got close, a feral noise, like the chittering of angry monkeys, pulsed from the vortex, followed by dozens of tiny claw-tipped hands. A flash of childhood glee pushed into Gryph's mind as he remembered the cartoon character, the Tasmanian Devil. Under different circumstances, Gryph would have laughed, but this was far from a normal situation. The tornado of talons punched into the Hell Lieutenant, slicing, dicing, and tearing at its flesh. Avernerius howled, and Gryph swore he heard a dozen tiny voices chortle in laughter as the vortex spun around the demon, a step ahead of each of his lumbering counterswings. Demon's blood sprayed in wide fans until rage took hold of Avernerius, and he decided enough was enough. He opened his mouth, and a hacking, shaking noise akin to a cat about to vomit retched inside him. A moment later, a plume of magma gushed from its mouth and splattered over the demon-filled vortex. The noise of dozens of cats burning alive tore at Gryph's ears, and then the cone of smoke and claws disappeared with a pop. Gryph helped Wick to his feet. Whatever that spell was, it took a lot out of the gnome. "That's all I got," Wick said, confirming Gryph's thoughts. Avernerius stood and glared. Gryph had no time to wonder why the demon kept its rage while he had become so passive, because the demon rushed them. It directed its ire at all of them, but as it looked down upon Wick, its anger flared to fury. Behind him, the several dozen surviving arachnids arrayed themselves, support for a monster who needed none. "I have an idea," Eret said, and looked down on his companion arachnid, a crestfallen look on his face. Unlike its fellows, Eret's pet, as Gryph thought of it, had stood close to the tall Warborn since the battle had begun, somehow immune to the subordination of the swarm. The spider cooed and reached a foot out to touch Eret. The Warborn nodded, and the spider sped off towards its fellows, zipping around a fiery cloven hoof that tried to crush it. An arc of green lightning zipped from Eret's arachnid and zapped one of its fellows. Then a chain reaction of cascading bolts jumped from one automaton to another. Soon the entire swarm trembled and exploded. Singly, the shrapnel and force from one of the doomed automatons would have barely scratched Avernerius's scaly hide, but dozens exploding all at once pummeled the demon with jagged bits of metal, surges of electrical power, and punishing waves of force. The demon crashed to its knees, dropped its sword, and coughed up brackish black blood. The sword clattered to the ground and disappeared in a puff of crimson smoke. For several seconds, it seemed as if the arachnid sacrifice would be the demon's end. But then it stumbled to its feet, its roar of uncontrolled rage momentarily deafening Gryph. He squeezed his eyes shut as his mind tried to push through the pain and disorientation. They snapped back open again when the locomotive loud cracking of Avernerius's hooves smacking stone barreled towards him. Gryph pumped mana into his bracers and threw his spear with all his might. The tip, accelerated by waves of magnetic force, slammed into Avernerius's thigh just as the demon whip-snapped its barbed tail at him. He felt the rush of air as it missed his head by inches. Gryph rolled aside, and the demon rumbled past. He used more mana to wrench the spear from the beast's leg, and it came free with a tear of meat and a spout of blood. A quick glance with Analyze told Gryph that the demon's health had dipped below 20%. It swung a backhand fist at Gryph, hitting him in the chest and knocking the wind out of him. Gryph's own health sunk, but the beast was no longer paying him any heed. Gryph must have missed part of the battle during his tumble, because as he regained his feet, he saw that Eret had lost his axe. The Warborn was dipping and dodging like a flyweight champ, raining punches down upon the slower demon. Eret is actually winning? Gryph thought in amazement. But then Avernerius caught the Warborn's fist and pulled down, smashing Eret's head onto its knee. The Warborn fell onto his face, stunned. Wick howled and sent a volley of thonic bolts into the demon's back. Then, with less effort than a man swatting a fly, the demon flicked its tail back. It spiked through Wick's chest and out through his back, purple blood dripping from the obsidian tip. A stunned look crossed the gnome's face, and he coughed up a spray of blood. His eyes locked onto Gryph's as he tried to speak, but nothing came. Then Avernerius lifted Wick off his feet, suspending him high above the stone floor. Wick screamed and held onto the barbed tail with both hands. With a casual flick of his tail, Avernerius launched Wick into the wall. The gnome hit with the wet thud of rotten fruit and slid down and into the water-filled sluiceway. The current took him, and he disappeared, dragged deeper into the bowels of the city. "No!" Gryph yelled and tossed his length of spider silk as he cast Animate Rope, hoping that the cooldown on the spell had passed. Nothing had ever felt so good as the smooth slide of the coil of rope as it zipped through his hands and into the frothing water. Gryph felt it twine around something, pulling hard on Gryph and threatening to yank him from his feet. He leaned back and pulled. "Eret, help! Please!" Gryph yelled and commanded the other end of the rope to fly to the tall Warborn as he wrapped it around his own waist. Another violent tug pulled Gryph off his feet and into the sluiceway. Mirthandir watched the rope wrap around Eret's forearm, and the Warborn's muscles strained to arrest the momentum of the gnome and the player. but the force of the channeled water wrenched at the construct's arm. He slid several more feet before he found secure footing and held fast. "Kill him!" Mirthandir said to Ovrim and Tifila, who were stripping off their chains now that Gryph's spell had faded. Ovrim took aim with his bow and sunk an arrow into the war-born's shoulder. The shock and the pain caused Eret to lurch forward, where he lost his footing and disappeared into the violent current. Mirthandir walked up to Ovrim and backhanded him. "You did that on purpose!" The Zaidai fell to his knees and stared up at the elf lord with a slight grin, his yellow eyes momentarily clear. Mirthandir scowled and closed his fist, and more of the black fog soared down and into Ovrim. The Zaidai's grin faded, his eyes became black once more, and the sedate expression of obedience returned. Rage battled reason on Mirthandir's face for several moments before a wicked smile curved his lips, and he looked from Tifila to Ovrim. "There is always time for those who are patient." He grabbed Ovrim by the chin. "And I'll make you take 10 lives for each of theirs and force her to kill her beloved, if he still lives." Mirthandir turned his back on them, and then a deep rumble announced the lowering of a massive ramp. "Time to say hello to the people of Sylvan Anor."